Phyllis, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. As I mentioned before we started recording, we probably have a lot to talk about. But in general, I'm really interested to hear about your views on therapy in America. And I think that can also apply to Canada, where I'm based. I
Oh,
would say
okay.
more America in general. But yeah. So before we jump into our conversation today, I do want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and share with the listeners a little bit about who you are and what's brought you here.
Yeah, I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years, and also an author. And all of my experience, both being a client myself, but also working with hundreds of clients over many years, has just really showed me that family dynamics play out everywhere. We are so much a product of the conditioning that we receive from the people that we're closest to and the people we depend on, and the kind of influences that are close to us in our communities. But in the world we live in today that is so flooded with media and the internet and instant communication all over the country and all over the world, we have so much conditioning coming from our larger environment. And so I wrote this current book, America in Therapy, to really talk about what are some of the influences that we're receiving in the largest family systems that are not healthy for us. And what have we learned from working with individuals and families and couples and children that we could use to help heal some of the really destructive and dangerous and harmful relationships that we're promoting in our country and around the world. So that's it in a
Absolutely. No,
nutshell. That's a nutshell.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And there's this whole, I think last time when we chatted, you mentioned and shared with me that there's this need for therapy in the country. Why do you feel that? Why is this there's this constant need? And I know you've touched on it in as far as the influence of social media goes and some of the
Right.
information we're inundated with, but why do you feel that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really pivotal question because one of the main reasons why I wrote the book is because I think our psychology and our understanding of how we work as human beings, how what affects us, how we relate to one another for better or for worse, our whole understanding of psychology internally and in our group dynamics, large and small, is the missing piece, I believe, in our political conversation and agenda today. And one of the reasons why I say that is because the whole focus of the best psychology and therapy is to heal our relationships with ourselves and with other people. And it's really not about blame. It's not about shame. It's not about retribution or punishment or ostracizing anyone. It's really about how can we heal our own wounds that have set us up to perhaps not be highly functional in our own relationships. How can we heal our own wounds and then spread that out? And basically what I've seen for people is that when people really devote themselves to healing the worst of what's happened to them, the worst of what they've internalized, and sometimes the worst of what they've done themselves in response to the harmful conditioning that they've gotten. When people have a chance to heal, they invariably become more cooperative, more loving, more kind, more patient. They have better boundaries. They're more committed to not being violent, even when they're upset or angry or hurt or fearful. And so it's that lens that I really want to bring to America and really to the world, because these things are happening all over the world that are harmful and destructive for people and potentially lethal for many people. And I think we're at this very critical place in human history where what we can do when we are unhealed, when we want to dominate other people just to get our perceived needs met, when we are invested in believing that some people are inferior or bad or sinners or whatever negative judgment we put on them, that we feel entitled to hurt them or take from them is causing the violence and the divisiveness that we're seeing around us and that is causing so much suffering with themselves, with other people. And when they really can't do that, to leave each other alone in peace. So we don't have that as our agenda. And I don't think we factor that into our politics. We still seem to be living in a paradigm of win lose. I'm going to beat you. I'm going to silence you. I'm going to shame you. I'm going to blame you. And I'm going to attack you in order to stay in power or get my needs met or have my agenda control everyone.
Hmm. Yeah. So what
And
I'm hearing from you there is really see it all the time too, and it's not necessarily just limited to politics, but
right,
if we all focused on healing ourselves and not focus on how other people are doing it or trying to, as you mentioned, shame others or judge others, there could be a lot of progress we can make as a
right,
group of individuals. And I think there's an aspect of shame that we attach, and with shame, it's just it's so tricky because rather than looking inward and healing, it's easier to project it onto others. So if
right,
I can point out all the flaws in the other person, I don't need to focus on the flaws I have within myself. And then what happens is just finger pointing. And you see this in
hmm,
families and relationships.
right,
And to your point, even at a larger scale, when it stretches out to politics, even between countries, different
right,
regions of the world. So you see that expanding everywhere. But what your point here is a lot of it you're seeing it within the country, and especially with politics right now. And we touched on the assassination attempt of Trump over the weekend too. There's again so much polarization even within that, where people are reporting it differently, and then there's a clash around that as well.
right, right.
Where do you see all of this going? And maybe before we go into where you see this going, I want to understand from your perspective, when did this start and why did it start?
I think it's been happening for a long time.
Hmm.
I don't know that there's a time it started. I think it's human nature to both compete and cooperate. I
Mhm.
think that's part of what has always been maybe an unquestioned foundation for our survival. We compete for better and more, and we cooperate for survival against nature, against our perceived enemies. And I think it's just escalated to the point where it's different now, I believe, in human history, because our ability to dominate each other and nature, the world we live in, is at such a peak that I think we have to become aware of is or are the ways that we have been able now to dominate through weapons, through psychological manipulation, through chemicals, and especially the weapons of mass destruction, for instance, because that could eliminate life as we know it. I think we have to really become conscious of choosing what we actually do with the knowledge and the ability and the skill and the expertise that we have. Do we may be able to make nuclear weapons. We may be able to make all kinds of fertilizers and chemical that we think will raise more crops or whatever, but are they good for us? Are they sustainable? And I think that's what therapy does in an individual person's life. Is what I'm doing serving me? Is it in my highest good? Is it in the good interest of the people around me? Does it serve a common good? Because one of the things that family systems has taught me, and it's probably the underlying theme of the book, is that
Mhm.
we're not islands. We used
Mhm.
to think psychologically there were just good and bad people. There were people with neuroses or complexes or disorders. And they were seen as islands as totally responsible for their ill health or their good health. And we now know from the world of family systems that's not the case, that we are very much conditioned by the role models and the behaviors and the experiences we have with the people around us. And if they're not healthy, then we are actually growing in a mentally unwell population. And there's
Mm.
many ways that we're actually doing that, along with all the good that we're doing. Like people don't go to the doctor for when they're healthy. They go to the doctor when they're suffering, and we're suffering. So
Mhm.
can we call on mental health professionals and people who understand the dynamics of healthy families and nonviolent communication and a host of other things? Can we call in the people who have some expertise to help us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to the other question then, in terms of where is this all going, and one of the problems I'm seeing is, unfortunately, everything we've talked about thus far, you've got people that haven't gone and sought healing. They haven't looked inward, and unfortunately, a lot of these people have made it into positions of power, which
Exactly.
influences all the choices they make, and that circle of influence then expands, right? So where do you see this going? And let's maybe just have more of a micro view in terms of just looking at it within the North American space. We don't have to wide, but from perspective, right? Because I'm seeing similar stuff in Canada as well, and even on the political front with the we've got the liberals and the conservatives here. And again, there's quite the divide in terms of the views and some of the values that people have. And there's no space to understand others' perspectives. There's just that
Right.
polarity again. So it's an
Right.
interesting time, like you said, but I'm curious to, again, I'm always curious to understand other people's views on where we think we're headed.
I think we can see where we're headed if we don't do something. I think it's if you have a fever or you have a rash or you have pain in your body, if you don't do something to try to heal it, chances are it could heal on its own. We could, but I don't think the passive approach is one that's really the right one right now because the dangers that we face, the infection in the body of the psyche of our country is pretty severe. So we could die from what we're doing. We could have a civil war. We could have states separating from each other. We could have an escalation of what we're already seeing. But I think what we're already seeing tells us where this could go. On the other hand, again, going back to the model of therapy, what brings people to get help? What brings people to actually try to heal or learn something new is pain. It's usually pain. It's usually suffering of some kind from something that really isn't working. They're having nightmares, or they're highly anxious, or they're addicted, or they're fighting with their partner, or their kids aren't talking to them, or they can't keep a job. It's that kind of thing. When something severe isn't working, that people tend to reach for help. And my hope is through my book and through talking, and of course, I'm not alone. There's many
Yeah,
people like me out there doing their own contribution to this. So I'm one voice among many. But what I would like my voice to be among many is that there are solutions that we know in families. And again, it's all imperfect. The human science is not perfect, but we have an idea of how to interrupt the cycle of violence. We have an idea of how to help people actually listen to one another and tolerate the distress of their disagreements or their different values or their different needs without acting out on each other. And we could learn that as a country. A country is just a group of people, so if individual people can learn it, a country can learn it. And I think the first step is to educate people about the severity of the disease we're suffering from and the possibility of actually turning it around and healing.
absolutely. And I think you've made a couple of references to, and you've shared this with me as well in terms of how you've approached the writing of your book, but you've talked about the family systems, talked about psyche, and naturally, my I kind of gravitate towards the Jungian approach too. It's just he was on to something way ahead of his time, I think, and from my perspective, there's a reason why he branched away from Freud as well. But there's something
Right.
important that Jung touched on was if we can't face the dark parts of ourselves, then they will continue to manifest in different ways. And that's what I'm seeing happen all across the world. And I know we talked about earlier in terms of when did this all start. I think this has always been the case in the human existence that we have when
Right.
you don't integrate that shadow or the different parts of yourself, they're going to continue to
That's
show
right.
up, and that's a message that you need to go face it and deal with it. So I that's what I'm hearing from you as well, but ultimately that's just been true for a very long time, and we're just seeing it at a different scale. I also think it's important to note that we're also digitally connected to such a larger extent that we are able to see it firsthand happening all across the world, whereas we may not
Right.
have had that luxury in the past.
So I think it's waking a lot of people up to
Mhm.
saying, let's heal the darkness in ourselves, but it's also having the influence of accelerating the darkness in other people who are not on a healing journey. So I think it has two sides of what's going on. And I think we have to identify that. But the thing that I really want to say about that darkness that is the result of our own unhealed wounds, and that it comes from being hurt, not being loved, or not feeling like you belong, or not feeling like you have value, or the people around you, you're invisible to them, or they don't cooperate with you, or they ostracise you. Yeah. The shadow comes from hurt from other human beings. People are not born evil or bad. They're not born going out into the world wanting to project negativity onto each other. We learn that and we can unlearn it. And I think that's we are still in a paradigm where a lot of what's being said and still believed is that there's just good and bad people, and we just have to conquer and suppress or kill the people that we think are bad, rather than understanding, which is what the gift of psychology is, that inside, whether you're someone who's passive and easily dominated or you're someone who's aggressive and dominating, both people have been disabled from their basic humanity and their ability to cooperate and share. And until we understand that people aren't just born evil, it's very hard to break the cycle of violence and hatred that we're in because we just keep labeling people. And one of the things that I think is so important about what you said, referring to Jung's statement, is that we have to make it safe for people to own their darkness.
Mhm.
Right now, we target people, we blame them, we judge them, we throw them in prison and throw away the key, and and we really make them other rather than understanding we're all in the same boat. We've all been hurt and we can all be hurtful. And of course, some people have been hurt worse and they're more hurtful, but it's the same dynamic in all of us. So if we I think what one of the major shifts that needs to happen is that we really make it safe to own our missteps and celebrate that we can do that. Rejoice in the fact that we can say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I said
Mhm.
something hurtful. I did something hurtful. And see that as a sign of strength and as a sign of accepting responsibility and have that be our role model as individuals and as a country.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, what I'm hearing from you on that front is having that level of compassion and empathy to understand others, and you make a very crucial point there because in the psychotherapy or psychology world, that's the idea where you're able to see your client, so they can feel heard,
Right.
seen, and understood, and we don't have that at a larger scale. To your point, we tend to otherize, and there's an aspect of you have to be able to understand that if someone's acting violently, it doesn't mean it's acceptable, but how can you understand why that may happen, right? I think
Right.
people also have short-term memory. So when you see a lot of issues across the world, you have to think about, again, historically, if you think about colonialism too, that's had an effect down the lineage of many people, and we forget
Right.
about that. And that trauma. It doesn't mean that you accept how people act in terms of that trauma. It's trying to understand how can you heal that trauma. And by violence, to your point, the violence is not going to solve the problem.
No, it's gonna perpetuate it, actually.
Yeah. Yes.
I always say people come to therapy to get out of the wars they're in.
Mm,
They're in the war already. And the fact that as a collective, we still believe in making war on one another is a sign that we haven't evolved our consciousness. We haven't evolved our psyches. We haven't healed. And that's not blame and shame. That's like saying you have a tumor, it needs to be removed if you want to stay alive.
yeah. When we are touching on Jung's work, and another aspect that he touched on was the idea of the soul. And for me, the way I've come to understand it is, at least again, this is just my perspective, there's different ways I can nourish my soul, and there's ways where I can take away from it. And the way I can nourish it is by focusing on love, peace,
Right.
contentment, as opposed to anger and bitterness and resentment. That takes me down. And again, everything we've touched on is shifting that focus. And when we focus on look at others and we otherize them and we perpetuate hate, that's also pulling away from our soul, and it doesn't help us evolve our psyche, as you touched on earlier. What are your thoughts with respect to that?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And whether you call it your soul or your heart or your essential self or your higher self, people have different words, but I think they all refer back to something that we know many people do, and some people have not had this experience because it's not been available to them, but
Mm,
something that we just know there's some essential self in there, some soul energy or some divine heart energy, whatever you call it, that really wants not only to be seen and cared for, but expressed in the world. It really, that part of us really wants to express itself and it wants to give the love that it holds to other people. And unfortunately, we live in a world that doesn't where we have this odd, and I say this is a mental health issue, and it's another reason why I bring the topics up that I do, that
mhm,
we actually all really wanna be loved in our lives. We wanna belong, we wanna feel valued, we wanna
mm,
feel, accepted, we wanna feel like people want us to be a part of the group, and that essential self, when it gets unburied from the traumas that have been heaped upon it, that we've developed our defenses, we hide or we are aggressive or we project, as you were
mhm,
saying, when that gets uncovered, which the best healing work does, it
mm,
uncovers that part of us, it sets it free, then we become those more loving people. Are we perfect? Do we do it right all the time? No. But we're more able to say, "I made a mistake. I'm sorry," and catch ourselves and come back. And that one of the things I like to say that's hopeful is we all know the term intergenerational trauma, how it gets passed down from one person to another, from one family to another, from one group, one country to another. But there's also intergenerational love and healing.
mhm,
And when one person heals, one family heals, when one group breaks the cycle of abuse and neglect and violence, that gets passed on too. And we can all be a part of that.
right. Yes, I agree. And we have so much agency with respect to that to influence that change by healing ourselves. And to your
Right.
point, you can put an end to that cycle. Now, the other piece you touched on was the need for connection. And I agree with you. As social beings, we want that connection. But unfortunately, if we haven't healed ourselves, we will tend to connect with the wrong group, with the wrong people in the wrong ways. Right. And I see
Right. Right.
that manifests as well, where you see a lot of hate taking place, even in that form, where people are able to, especially vulnerable people, are able to find that sense of connection through the wrong ways, and then
Hmm.
they direct that anger outwards onto another group that they may not see in the same light. And that goes back to everything we've touched on in terms of the polarization and the othering we're seeing even in our countries where people are finding that connection with their political views. And then
Right.
anyone else who doesn't hold the same views or beliefs is
Right.
a bad person, exactly like you were
Right.
touching on. And it's become a big problem. And I agree with you. I think there needs to be some sort of common ground that we can agree on. But I think I struggle with that unless we have it healed. And then you can see the pain in others, you can see the hurt in others, but you can also start identifying the humanity in others and the love and the care they
Exactly.
carry. And that's probably the shift that needs to happen the most.
Oh, I think you're making an excellent and a much needed point, because we are seeing exactly what you're saying, that people are finding their sense of belonging by identifying with extremes, with the raw of an extreme group that looks like it has power that maybe the individual people don't feel like they have in their own lives. But
Mhm,
I think, again, I think psychology holds so much understanding about that phenomenon. And one of the ways to understand it, and I just think we need this knowledge, just like we need to know how a bacteria works or a virus works, or what happens if you drink water that has germs in it or has been polluted. It's the same thing with our psyche. We have to know what happens to us if we're going to have a chance to correct it. So, one of the things that happens when people are hurt, when they feel left out, when they're targeted, when there's discrimination or blame or overt abuse in their lives, is that we call this as in psychological terms, we tend to repeat what we know. It's
mhm,
called the repetition compulsion. It's just we're still wanting love from the people that hurt us.
mhm,
So unconsciously, we get attracted to people who are like the people who hurt us,
mhm,
still trying to get their love, their approval, and a sense of belonging from them.
mhm, mhm,
And if we don't interrupt that cycle of violence and abuse and neglect in the home and in the immediate environment of children growing up in their communities, then we can expect to have more and more people who are going to repeat what they learned. And they learn to either be passive because they really had no power, or they learn to be aggressive because they've identified with the people that hurt them. And then as they grow up, the people who are aggressive look for people who are passive to dominate, and the people who have become helpless and passive through no fault of their own are easily dominated and manipulated.
mhm.
And I think this is happening in epic proportions in the human race.
Yeah.
And it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and I think at least the way I've come to understand it, I've seen the drama triangle quite a bit and in therapy work, and that's essentially what's happening, right? Like you're saying, you've got the victim, you've got the victimizer, and then the drama continues to play out between them, and then that label can extend to a larger group. It doesn't always have to be limited to
Right?
individuals, and that's a problem. But the other thing you touched on there is this sense of validation. And again, it comes back to healing. So I know we're repeating the need for healing.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important.
That's the theme,
Yeah.
right?
But to your point, if we haven't healed, then we'll continue to put ourselves in similar situations over and over again to get that validation, to feel good enough, which is again a feeling that we get out of shame that I'm not good enough. So I need to constantly get this validation. And you often see that even in a limited scale when you see someone, and they end up being with a similar partner over and over again. And you're
Exactly.
like, what's going on? Did you not learn from the last relationship? So you're repeating the same patterns. It's because they haven't healed that need and they're just seeking it through those relationships. And we can, again, extend that to a larger scale in terms of how people behave in the world around them as well.
I mean, that's such a great point. And you actually said what I was about to say, which is that's what brings a lot of people to therapy is they find themselves in the same relationship over and over again. And obviously, it's a relationship that doesn't work and that is hurtful to them or dysfunctional in some way. And they're really looking for how to break that cycle. And the way to break that cycle is to address what wounded them in the first place. and set them up unconsciously to repeat a pattern that only hurt them in the past and it continues to hurt them in the present. And we can look at our country that way too. We've had we have all kinds of harm that we have suffered as individuals and as groups, and we have all kinds of harm that we've perpetrated. And when do we get to the place where we say, enough, let's stop this cycle and stop? Because we're repeating so much of what we've done that doesn't work.
Yeah, no, and I don't think you solve problems with violence or hate
Right.
because you're going to bring that back to yourself in different ways. Now, we touched on the piece of connection and how people tend to connect with others, but one of the biggest things I've been talking about quite a bit in this podcast, but something that I've really internalized for myself is the connection I have with myself. And to me, that has been quite the journey, and I think it's a journey that I will continue on for the rest of my life. But by finding that ability to heal, I've been able to connect with myself on a deeper level. And it's something that I really value and cherish because it's allowed me to then extend that connection outward towards the universe or I think just humanity in general. What are your thoughts on that? Because I find so many people that are stuck in their patterns and they can't find that sense of healing, they struggle to connect with themselves. So then they often internalize it as when they're alone as loneliness rather than actually pursuing that sense of solitude so they can finally connect and find a deeper sense of healing within themselves. I don't just want your
Well,
thoughts on that.
yeah, I think that's a very another very important thing to emphasize because I actually think that's part of healing. Part of real healing is a deep and lasting and profound connection to oneself
Mm-hmm,
because and I think part of the tragedy of the abuse and neglect that goes on in so many homes, and again, I say that not to blame people,
mm-hmm,
but to say this is a tragedy that we could try to heal, really help families, help stop this cycle of abuse and neglect that is so widespread in America today. And having heard so many people's stories over so many years, I can tell you it's widespread, even if it doesn't look that way from the outside. So, yes, that connection to oneself in the best and the deepest therapy that I've done with people who have really stuck around,
mm-hmm,
that is inevitably what happens.
mm-hmm,
And I think that part of the tragedy of our not so healthy environment on a continuum is that people are taught very early on not to trust their own
mm-hmm,
sense of things, or it's dangerous to trust their own sense of things, that they have to rely on other people for their survival, for their safety, for being provided for. And if you're in a position where your survival depends on someone who doesn't want you to trust yourself, then it's dangerous to do that. And you have to become safe for most people. Of course, there's always exceptions. There's people who just trust themselves no matter what, and are willing to walk through any fire to hold on to that. And God bless all of us who are able to do that. But there are many people who don't, who are so injured, who are so fearful, who have been so mistreated that the last thing they want to do is listen to their own inner self and plumb those depths because it feels really dangerous to do that. And that's part of the reason why we need to heal as a as larger groups because and I think we just don't know this as a civilization, the very best that people have to offer lies in that connection to who they really are.
mm-hmm.
I've
Yeah,
never
no,
seen anybody do healing work that doesn't become a more wonderful human being.
yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think in my limited time working in therapy, I have found that too, where people, where they're able to find the deepest connection within themselves, that's when they experience the most growth and healing. And
Absolutely.
that's no coincidence for sure. Now, the other piece we touched on earlier was social media and the devices and Now we know some of the substances that are out there. Often people will use those as a way of trying to connect, but they're not really connecting with themselves, right? And I find like we've
Mhm.
been given a lot of more distractions now that prevent us from finding those connections, because it's easy. If I'm feeling lonely, I could just go on my phone and then try to delude myself that, hey, I'm still connecting with the world, whereas I'm not taking that time to do it with myself, and not really. And I think what happens for a lot of people is because of the coming back full circle with Jung's work too, in order to integrate a lot of those parts of ourselves, we have to feel that discomfort. We have to be okay with some of those difficult emotions that arise. And for a lot of people, it's tough to deal with it because it allows you to be really honest with yourself and take responsibility, like you said, responsibility for your own healing. And many people are not ready for it. There's shame attached to it, like we talked about. There's fear, there's pain, and there's generally unwillingness to go there for many people.
Yeah, and I think that's very cultural. I mean, very, very much a part of our culture that we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to show our flaws or our insecurities or the places where we haven't lived up to our own or other people's expectations, blah, blah, blah. And also the things that we've done that we're not proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it, but I think the hope lies in that if one person does it, that it shifts the tide for other people, and I've been witness to that so many times, as you probably have been too. I
Mm-hmm.
was in a very large family gathering and several years ago, and me and my kids were the sharer types. Like we do that. And not everybody in that circle by any means was like that. And my daughter, so a couple, but we went around the whole, it was celebrating someone's birthday, and
Mm-hmm.
we were going to go around this large table and each share something. And the first couple of shares were so constricted and just on the very surface of any kind of self revelation. And then my daughter just expressed the most vulnerable personal share, and the whole room changed. It literally changed in that moment. And as we went around the table, the most incredible shares came out of people who don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what kind of a seed change we can each be by being courageous enough to be vulnerable. And I don't know if this is your experience. When I was young, I didn't share anything. I
Mm-hmm.
thought I didn't even know you could share anything vulnerable. I didn't even know the word vulnerable probably. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's such a source of freedom for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a source of liberation and claiming my humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I love being around people who are willing to do that.
Yeah.
And we just don't know the effect if you're that one person in the room. And you may not have that effect. Other people may shut down, but that doesn't mean we still can't keep trying.
Absolutely. And as you were sharing that, I was nodding my head because I agree with you. I've experienced that myself. Again, growing up as a boy and a man in this world, you get socialized in a certain way, especially around vulnerability. It's tougher for men in general. And we see some of the impacts of that, unfortunately, with the suicide rates as
Right.
well. But
Right.
I've been able to change that for myself and some of the people in my social circle as well, where being part of men's
Mhm.
groups, that's been really powerful. And exactly like you shared with respect to your daughter, it's the same when one man is able to put their vulnerability out there and just share something very deep and profound in terms of what they might be going through or struggling with. It takes the pressure off everyone. It's like this, there's just the room feels lighter because now everyone's okay, I can also be vulnerable. And now you're able to see each other, and everything we've talked about in terms of the healing part
Right.
is ultimately, even as therapists, when people are coming into our room, they just want to be seen, because majority of
That's
the
right.
times I've come to realize with the clients I work with that they've never had that opportunity in their life. And it's the first
Exactly.
time they're actually being seen and understood.
Exactly. And it's so true. I've had clients who no one ever told them that they loved them.
Mhm.
They just don't have that experience. But I love what you're saying also because when someone opens that door and other people are allowed into that beautiful, safe space, we stop projecting onto each other because the shadow is just owned. And
Mhm.
it's such a beautiful thing.
Yes. Yeah, the shadow no longer has that power anymore once it's put
Right.
out in the open. And
Right.
you touched on the cultural aspect, and we've obviously talked through that quite a bit too. But in terms of the secularized world we live in, do you feel like that contributes a lot more to it? Because for me, I'm a person of faith and I've been able to get a deeper understanding of my faith. And part of my connection with myself has allowed me to connect with my higher power. And that's really transformed my life and healing. And I'm able to see a part of me in others as well. So that allows me to have that level of compassion. It's still a work in progress. But do you feel like that's where that disconnect is in the world we live in because people have become more secular?
I'm not sure exactly what all the contributing factors are, but the
Mm,
thing that comes to my mind when you say that is that I think we may be, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
mm,
We may be evolving out of religion per se that
mhm,
can be dogmatic, that can be
mhm,
exclusive, that can be very judgmental,
mm,
to owning and experiencing that spiritual connection within ourselves, not needing an intermediary, not having to have any kind of dogma attached to it.
mhm,
That's been my experience. I grew up in a certain religion, but I have no affiliation to that religion right now. My connection to my higher self and to spirit, and which I highly value and definitely was helped by my healing process or maybe enabled by my healing process,
mhm,
um, is non-denominational. And
mhm,
I think we might be really trying as a race of beings to evolve to that place where we honor that within each other. And you don't have to belong to a certain organization to have
mhm.
that. Does that make sense to you?
I think so. And I do agree, dogma can be problematic because it forces people to be rigid. And, and I think that's where I see a lot of the issues is the rigidity. Whereas I think you need to be a bit flexible in terms of your understanding and how you interpret things. And a lot of the times, and I say this with no judgment, people don't take the time to go and understand things. They often take things that they're told at face value and they just run with it.
Right,
And that's where a
right.
lot of that, again, the issues arise from my perspective. But I do agree we are evolving. And if one is to be able to have that deeper level of spiritual connection within themselves, then you start seeing through some of the mundane things and the little petty things that
Mhm.
we tend to focus on otherwise, and you rise
Right.
above it and you're able to just let go and understand that okay, it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Like I think for me, just focusing on just my mortality in general has allowed
Mhm.
me to let go of many things because to me it's okay if I've got another 40, 50 years left, this is not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. So it's easier to let go, and then the focus shifts to okay, how can I focus on things beyond the material world, maybe helping other people's out, maybe leaving a better impression, um, or leaving things better than I found them, and that has really
Right.
helped me in general.
I love that. And I think that all comes from your connection,
Hmm.
your deepening connection to yourself. And,
Yes.
and that's what I see happens for people. I had a client who couldn't say the word love.
Mm,
It not only didn't experience it, but couldn't tolerate even saying the word love because the level of abuse and neglect and trauma was so deep in this person. And as they made their journey through the darkest part of their life, They were able to do that. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. There's such a deep connection to spirit this person made that you would never have predicted. And so
Yeah.
anything's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything is truly possible. I agree. I don't, Phyllis, we've gone quite the exploration there and quite the journey, but I'm curious, is there anything else you feel like we haven't touched on that is of importance, especially with respect to the work you've done and what you're trying to put out into this world? Is there anything we didn't touch on that you would like to add?
Oh, there's half of my book or whatever. But but no, there probably are many things, but I think one thing that I would like to say is that I think one of the big challenges we face, and that I think if we name it, we could begin to take it on, and that is that the challenge of speaking truth to power with love.
Mm,
We don't That's something that I never learned, I never heard spoken. I didn't know anybody who could do that because that's what's healing. We have to be able to speak the truth. We have to be able to say, this is a cancer in the body. This is destructive in our behavior, and speak that to power from a place of conviction, power itself, appropriate power, but also love, which means I'm speaking that to you to heal it, not to blame and shame. And I think that's what
yes.
we're really
Yes, I
confronting.
agree. And think, yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that's really important too. Thank you, Phyllis. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you, learn from you, also understand how you're bringing about change in the world, which is really important. But for listeners that want to learn more about your work, if they want to get a hold of you or find you online, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah. I mean, the best and easiest place is to go to my website, which is www.phyllislevitt.com. You can contact me through my website. You're welcome to write me at my business email, which is phyllis@phyllislevitt.com. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I love sharing what I think is valuable, and I love hearing what other people how we have a conversation. It's not just a monologue, but it's a sharing and a conversation in and of itself. And I'm on all the social media. I have lots of interviews on YouTube. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, and I have articles on Substack, and I've written some blogs. And I think if you just probably Google my name, it all comes up. But I just really do want to, and I just really want to emphasize if anyone is interested in reading my book, it just finally got published on July 2nd. Please buy it, please share it, please write a review so we can hit the algorithms and just spread a healing word.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely put all of that in the show note captions so people can find all that information. But thank you again, Phyllis. This was quite the honor to have you on here and share some of the work you're doing.
Thank you, because it was an honor and a pleasure to talk with you and to talk with someone who speaks the same language and has some of the same understanding. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You're welcome.